Greetings to all of the teachers preparing to take the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida's 25th Annual Summer Teachers Institute. My name is Mitch Bloomer, and I have been the resource teacher at the Holocaust Center these past 25 years, and I welcome you to our institute. This session is going to introduce to you some key ideas about teaching about the Holocaust in Florida, both the academic and the affective goals of Holocaust education. Now, before we get started, I'd like you to ask yourself just a few questions about what you hope to get out of this week. First of all, what would you like to learn? And by that I mean, what would you like to learn about the Holocaust as it happened in history? What would you like to learn about best practices for teaching about the Holocaust? What would you like to learn about why it's important for us to learn about the Holocaust, to think about who we are today and who we want to be? What kind of people, what kind of nation, what kind of world? I'd also like you to ask yourself, as a teacher, what would you like to be able to do by the time you finish this institute? Something maybe that you weren't confident in beforehand, and you will be confident to the max at the end. I'd also like you to ask what you want your students to learn from your teaching about the Holocaust next time you teach about the Holocaust in your classroom. And finally, I'd like you to ask yourself, what do you want your students to be able to do with the learning that they've acquired? Now, in order to help us to think our way through this, I'd like to recommend what I like to call the what, so what, now what strategy of learning history. So this is really wrapping the study of history around three essential questions. What happened? And by what happened, we mean the events. Any study of history should really begin by nailing down the events that are to be studied. Now, this doesn't mean that the end of the process is memorizing facts or names or details, but establishing what occurred so that students can move on to the second question. And this is really a great student question. So what? It could also be phrased as, why should I care? Why does this matter? And I think that that really is a key question. Another way perhaps to phrase it would be, why is this important? Now, in general, things from history can be important for two main reasons. Either the events in question were milepost events helping to shape the future that would come afterward. So if there's an event in history which had a shaping influence on subsequent events, then that would be important. Another reason an event or series of events might be important could be because those events speak directly to our identity and our values. So if there's a period in history or a series of events that cause us to ask ourselves, who are we? What kind of people do we want to be? In this period, did we live up to our values, or did we fail to live up to them? And what can we learn from this? So that's the so what, and that's the second step. The third step, and I think this one is the most important, is the question, now what? Or in other words, now that I know this, what should I do? Because we always want student learning to lead to changes in attitude, changes in behavior, personal, social, as well as academic growth. Now, this leads us to what Florida law tells us about our goals for Holocaust education. Since the summer of 1994, there has been a paragraph in the Required Instruction chapter of the Florida statutes directly related to the teaching of the Holocaust. And what you see on the screen there is the text of that law. Now, I've broken it out for you into 6 goals. The first thing, of course, is that we teach students the history of the Holocaust, but not just the history of the Holocaust as a watershed event, in a way of saying the world is not the same after the Holocaust as it was beforehand. Now that one's about history. The last 5 are pro-social goals. So we're to teach the history of the Holocaust in a way that helps us and helps students to investigate human behavior. Why did people act the way they did back in those days, for good as well as for ill? We're also supposed to use Holocaust education to help students understand the ramifications of prejudice and racism and stereotyping. These, of course, are forces in history much larger than the simple time period of the Holocaust. They are part of the human condition. But what happened in the Holocaust gives a great opportunity to study what happens when prejudice holds sway, when racism is the organizing principle of a society, and when stereotyping substitutes for understanding and careful analysis. We're also supposed to use the Holocaust to examine what it means to be a responsible and respectful person. And this, of course, is directly related to pro-social behavior, whether we're talking about people who were alive during the time of the Holocaust or the students in our classrooms today. We're also supposed to use Holocaust education to encourage tolerance of diversity in a pluralistic society. And this, by the way, is a remarkable statement made by the Florida legislature in the 90s to recognize in an official state document with the force of law that we are a pluralistic society and that diversity is a virtue and not something to be feared or rejected. And finally, we're to use the Holocaust to help teaching about the Holocaust to help students to know the importance of nurturing and protecting democratic values and institutions. So these are the requirements that have been in place now for the last 26 years. But this past legislative session, 2020, there have been some new requirements that have been passed by the Florida legislature, and assuming that they are going to be signed by the governor, and by the way, they were passed with no objection, 0 no's in both the House and the Senate, I would assume that the governor will sign this law, and it is going to put some new teeth into the requirement for Holocaust education. And there are 6 things I want to mention about this new law. First of all, it instructs the Department of Education to develop standards and curricula for teaching the history of the Holocaust. As it stands now, we have the Florida mandate written in the instructional requirements chapter, but when you look at standards and benchmarks in the next generation Sunshine State standards for social studies, the Holocaust really only appears twice and with very little actual direction. So this is designed to change that. The bill also is going to add the state's definition of anti-Semitism and require the teaching of current and historical examples of anti-Semitism and strategies to prevent anti-Semitism to the instruction of the Holocaust. And in keeping with this idea, Monday morning we're going to be looking at the broad topic of anti-Semitism as one of the first sessions in our Teachers Institute. This bill is also going to require the Department of Education to create a process that each district will certify compliance with Holocaust instruction. Now, if your principals are aware of this, you may find them turning to you if they know that you've come to this Teachers Institute to help to define what compliance is going to mean and how to document it for your school and to help in documenting it for the district. This bill is also going to authorize the Department of Education to seek input from Florida's Task Force for Holocaust Education and also from recognized Holocaust educational organizations such as the Holocaust Memorial Center right here in Maitland to help to establish new standards and curricula. This will also hold true for the development of teacher training materials and grade-appropriate classroom resources. And again, you may find yourself being called upon to help your school to design appropriate classroom activities and resources. And then finally, the second week in November is going to be designated as Holocaust Education Week. One other thing I'd like to say about this before we move off this slide, this law um, is entitled Educational Instruction of Historical Events, and it does something that I think is very wise, and which I think a lot of teachers have done unofficially. It links the teaching of certain racist incidents in American history pertaining to the persecution of African American citizens and the Holocaust. And so this same law is going to require schools to create strategies for teaching about the massacre in Ocoee back in 1920, and that of course has direct relevance right in our Central Florida community. Now, for us, the Holocaust Center, our objective for you this week is that this institute will help you to find meaningful and accurate and effective ways to incorporate Holocaust education content into your classroom. But we know that you have different backgrounds, you teach different subjects, different grade levels, and in fact, the Holocaust mandate was always intended to be one that called for the inclusion or the embedding of Holocaust instruction as broadly as possible throughout the K-12 curriculum, even in elementary school, where you might not actually teach students about the history of the Holocaust, but you might teach about one or more of those 5 pro-social goals that I showed you in the last screen, or the several screens ago. So we hope that the outcome for this week for you will be that you'll gain confidence, that you have access to resources, understanding of best practices, and that you'll be equipped to help both yourself and students find relevance in Holocaust education for our lives today and for the understanding of the modern world. Now, in order to incorporate Holocaust education into your classroom, there's really 4 basic strategies that we can use. The first one is to just teach directly about the Holocaust as required by Florida law. So create a unit of some length that will help you to take your students chronologically through the history of the Holocaust, touching on those high points that are directly relevant to those goals that were listed in the mandate. But I've discovered over the years that a lot of school principals don't like this approach and ask their teachers when they want to teach about the Holocaust, show me how this fits directly into your curriculum and how this satisfies the standards and the benchmarks that you're required to teach. Now, it has happened in recent years that in some schools, and this is just an example, that in a civics class, for example, principals have given the green light to teachers to teach an entire unit about the Holocaust after the state exam. So in the second half of May, for example, for 2 or 3 weeks. And that's wonderful if that's something that can work. But there are a lot of classes where the standards and the benchmarks are so tightly packed that it would be difficult to carve out a dedicated block of time to teach about the Holocaust all at once. So another approach that you could perhaps take is to address one of those 5 pro-social behavior mandate components of the mandate through non-Holocaust topics, like, for example, when dealing with the ramifications of prejudice and racism. If you're teaching the 11th grade U.S. history course at the high school level, there'll come a time when you're going to teach about Jim Crow and segregation. And so you could perhaps, while teaching about segregation, use examples also from the Holocaust to support the teaching that you're doing from American history. In fact, that's one of the ways that that social studies teachers can increase rigor is to use multiple examples from different contexts and different time periods in history to support the same standard, the same benchmark. Now, another thing that you could do is you could use benchmarks or standards that support certain academic skills, like in social studies using timelines or document analysis, or in English language arts, interpreting informational text or author's intent and purpose. And you could use Holocaust content, history content, to help students to practice those skills. That's a third method. The fourth method is that you could address Holocaust education requirements through some of the other educational mandates. Now, I already mentioned how that might be done with the African American History and Culture mandate that's also part of required instruction. But another thing that you could do, for example, is you could use lessons from the Holocaust, and particularly lessons about people who acted as rescuers during the Holocaust, to support the Jeffrey Johnston Stand Up for All Students Act, which is Florida's bullying prevention in schools law. So you can look for other ways to incorporate Holocaust education into your classroom, and these are 4 ways that you could possibly do it. Now, over time, and I'm going way back into the past, there has been a traditional approach to teaching about the Holocaust, and I'd like to just give you a warning about this traditional approach. And I don't mean to stereotype the way that any teaching's been done in the past, but here's what I'm talking about. Um, an approach to teaching about the Holocaust where the narrative begins with Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party, almost as if they drop in out of the sky, and there had been no precedent for them or their ideas earlier in history. So this approach would locate the causes of the Holocaust really mainly in the aftermath of Germany's defeat in World War I. The political, economic, and social conditions that came about because Germany lost the war and because of the Versailles Treaty. Now, that's not to say that these things are not important. It is to say that blaming the entirety of the Holocaust or even the Nazi movement on just these factors alone oversimplifies history and will lead students to missing some very important points that I think will help make Holocaust education more meaningful for them. And then the traditional approach tends to focus primarily on the later years of the Holocaust, the genocidal mass murder program, or on the conditions in concentration camps. Now, it's true concentration camps existed from the beginning to the end of the Holocaust era, but when people think about them, they tend to think about them as they were at the time of liberation, and so that locates their concept in the last period of the war. Now, problems that come up with this approach are that this approach tends to blame the Nazis and their behaviors exclusively, and framing them as if they are unique. That it's almost impossible to understand how there could have been a Nazi movement. You know, kids shake their heads and don't understand why anybody would have ever thought those ideas or followed those leaders. Of course, there isn't a Holocaust without Hitler, the Nazi movement, and their takeover of Germany, and their behaviors during the entire Holocaust era and the conquests of World War II. But those are more complex than this traditional approach tends to give credence to. And by the way, here we should also point out that we shouldn't think about the Nazis as monsters. If in fact we call the Nazis monsters, then the educational lesson of the Holocaust is beware of monsters. And that's not very helpful. But if we see them as people, subject to the normal forces of history and the normal social pressures that all people face and all societies face, then we can begin to try to unravel some explanations as to why they thought what they thought and did what they did. This approach does tend to also ignore the fact that there were many people who participated in the Holocaust who were not Nazis, who were not German, but they were nevertheless perpetrators or collaborators. And it also tends to view the Nazis as a monolith and takes away the role of individual choice in the behaviors that ultimately constituted the Holocaust crime. Um, Now, like I mentioned on the last slide, this approach also tends to focus on the genocidal period from 1941 to 45, or the extreme brutality of occupation from 39 to 45, at the expense of the developments that occurred before the World War, which were actually foundational. So much so that I would say you really can't get to any of the crimes of the war period unless you have these foundational events from 1933 to 1939, and even the propaganda and the stereotyping of Jews that happened beforehand. So, for example, the segregation and removal policies of the German government towards Jews um, is often ignored, and that's a very pivotal period in the Holocaust. It also tends to shed some also unwelcome light on the tepid responses from other nations, whereas a more vigorous response might have actually had an effect on later events. Um, Finally, this doesn't help students to recognize universal principles. For example, there is a moment in the mid to late 1930s that we refer to as the Jewish refugee crisis, where if other nations in the world had been more willing to receive endangered Jewish refugees before the war began, many more lives would have been saved. Now, if you look at that history, then it might help students to think about refugee issues today and what are our obligations to protect and to defend people who are targeted victims, whether they're within one particular society or whether they've escaped and are now stateless refugees. And finally, the traditional approach often silences the victims. So let me just use these photographs here to help to illustrate my point. Now, here are some very powerful photographs taken from the liberation of concentration camps, and I am in no way suggesting that you should not use these or show them to your students. Now, I do think that I should say all teachers should think about what's age appropriate for their students. I didn't pick the worst photos you could see here, but when you look at these photos, notice a couple of things. Number one, the condition of the prisoners distances them from a picture of normal life. Students might have a hard time identifying with people in such a state of abuse and neglect, and might find it difficult to identify with them. On top of that, these photographs show the essence of what we decry when we talk about nameless and faceless victims. And of course, victims of atrocities deserve for their individuality, for their dignity, for the substance of their lives to be known and remembered. No one would want to be remembered by these pictures as the only evidence of the fact that they had lived in this world. So there is an appropriate use for photos like these, but we need to stretch our teaching methods to accomplish more. So, for example, here's a photograph that I like, except for that I have doctored it a little bit. Now, if you ask students to look at this photo and to identify who they thought might be in the foreground of the picture, who they might be as individuals, who they might be collectively as a group, what they might be doing, you could probably get a lot of different answers. And then after you've allowed students to brainstorm a little bit, you could show them the photo as it actually existed. And here's the photo before I doctored it. You can probably notice the difference right away, that the people in the foreground have been labeled as Jews, forced to wear a badge of identification, which the Nazis clearly meant to be a badge of shame and a badge of isolation. Um, but once people have seen these individuals as husband, wife, father, mother, travelers, members of a community, then to see them labeled as you see them in the lower right hand, um, it really stands out as inappropriate and wrong behavior. And so we face this situation. It's a little bit of an irony that we actually build respect for diversity on common ground when we recognize that we share many of the life roles in common with the people that are seen in this picture. Now, what I'm recommending here also is that we use sources from diverse sources and perspectives to build this empathetic understanding. So I'm going to recommend that throughout the week we look for and identify abundant primary sources, such as diaries and oral histories, documents, newspaper reports, art, poetry, music, plays, photos, to help us to understand the people who were the victims of the Holocaust. Now, we should do this, and we should do it, like I said, with abundance. But don't rely only on primary sources, because there's no source that I've listed above that doesn't have its own drawbacks as well as strengths. So secondary sources are also very powerful. We should also make sure that we represent all periods of the Holocaust era, not just the later years, or for that matter, not just the early years, not just Germany, not just the occupied East, but all areas, all geographic regions. And we should strive to represent the victim's perspective. Let's not let their voices be silenced. But the victims can't tell the story all by themselves. We have to include evidence from the perpetrators. What did they say? What did they write? From collaborators, bystanders, rescuers, liberators, allied leaders. You can go on, but a multitude of voices are necessary. And finally, we should also use sources beyond the most famous ones. So don't rely only on quotes from Anne Frank's diary or from Night by Elie Wiesel, which, by the way, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use those. Those are wonderful sources. But no source like that can tell the whole story. So we should pull together multiple accounts and many sources. And finally, one of the best practices of Holocaust education is to give students plenty of time to reflect on their learning. Many ways to represent their reflections in writing and in other ways of representing meaning. So that, I think, will serve as a good starting off point, an introduction for what we're going to do throughout this coming week. If you have any questions, not just about this presentation, but about the requirements, if you're seeking the stipends and going to do the follow-up activities and receive the books, or just if there's anything else that comes up, please feel free to email me at the one of the two email addresses you see on this slide. I will say that if you call the number, you'll reach the Holocaust Center, but you can leave a message for me that will come directly to my inbox. So I recommend calling that number as well. And so I look forward to seeing you in session on Monday morning at 10 a.m., and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. This has been Mitch Bloomer, resource teacher at the Holocaust Center.